I like to highlight that it is very important that if you've got a regulation, it must be set, it creates certainty. It must create certainty. And it must be consistent and congruent. Because if you've got any regulation that is not creating certainty and inconsistent or is not congruent, it results into what we call unintended consequences. And I think a lot of what Herman was talking about is unintended consequences of the regulations that have been in place. And I believe that if we look at regulation, particularly policy and regulation, it has to address this. If it doesn't address any of this, then it's actually misplaced. And so the government has got a huge responsibility of balancing act, introducing regulation, and at the same time ensuring that that regulation is promoting sustainable development. And therefore, it is very, very important that we understand that delicate balance. Because if you miss it, then you mess it up. All of us as executives and business leaders know that regulation is something that you need to be extremely aware, particularly in this industry, because energy industry, of the strategic nature of it, the government wants to be closely associated with. Now let me tell you, if some of you, I'm sure most of you were here, 2005 we had major shortages in December in this country. You would not have found petrol in any of the service stations. And a commission of inquiry was instituted by a judge called Morane and to investigate. And his conclusion, and I want to read that, fuel shortage resulted from a convergence of a number of factors. Of greater importance and concern, however, is the fact that these events expose underlying structural and regulatory weaknesses. And that actually is something that we need to be working on all the time and making sure that it is. Now let me just give you a few examples. If you've got good regulation, it must start with a policy formulation, that is, and then legislation and regulation, and it must be in sequence and it must be quick. Another unintended consequence is once you introduce regulation, for instance, once you regulate accounting, you could now, as a business, invest in a new computer system that will generate information in a format that the regulator wants. Now that's a huge expense. I remember when I was running oil, we had to employ 5 new accountants in the finance department in order to be able to actually just generate the information that is required in order to satisfy the regulation. And that's cost that is added unnecessarily in the business. And you need, in our business, the margins are pretty thin. You need to sell many, many liters to be able to pay for that. So problems very often arise from equally conflicting imperatives and result in misaligned priorities from government. Some of the regulations that we need are important. I mean, let me just say up front, environmental concern is something that all of us are concerned about, and I'm particularly concerned about. We must make sure that this earth is an earth that we live for our future generation. We need to balance particularly the fact that we are a poor country, and we need to make sure that we do things that are not hindering our economic growth. For instance, the National, I call it Air Quality Act. Good act. All of us have to live in the ambience air that is great, but there's some challenges. Clean fuels, cleaner fuels, it's coming. Those are the things of carbon tax and climate change. And sometimes the framework is quite important, that you have a big picture first in terms of policy framework, and then you make sure that it talks to each other. Every legislation, for instance, the Clean Fuels and Waste Act, there's 2 major environmental laws. One is air quality, and then another one is clean fuels. And all of us means we must, those big refineries that we have must be reconfigured. If I were to use an example of my car, if you've got to change the entire gearbox, or you've got to change the entire, and you've got to do all these things simultaneously at the same time. By 2017 onwards, we must comply with clean fuels, we must comply with air quality. And it's billions and billions and billions of rands which have got no return. It becomes very important that we do the balance. We have to do it in a way that does not economically destroy the businesses that we have. Conclusion recommendations that I'd like to make in terms of the energy regulation is that we must have a clarity of purpose. It's very important when we're there. And we must make sure that all stakeholders cooperate and create an effective regulatory framework that we all need. And a regulatory framework must create an environment that is conducive for investment, but add value to our country, to our nation. It's very important that we do so. But it must eradicate all the kind of inefficiencies. Sometimes we create a regulation because people have really been inefficient in the systems in which they've created. And then obviously making sure that we develop a regulatory framework that always balance the needs of our country in terms of development, in terms of poverty alleviation and unemployment and inequality, but at the same time attract investors both locally and internationally. Regulators must be also the efficient systems. I mean, sometimes they've sorted it out now, but I know that sometimes the DOE, just to apply for a license, used to take you a long time. And we need to make things work now. Alignment, and making sure that everything is aligned. And I believe that if we can be able to do that, regulation are not going to be a swear word. It will help achieve our objectives, which is reduce unemployment, making sure that we alleviate poverty, in fact, eradicate poverty, and then making sure that people in this country, the inequality gap is closed.